Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this live stream at SAG-AFTRA on YouTube. To stay informed about all of our live stream and video events, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. You can do it right now. Today, we welcome to the President's Task Force on Education, Outreach, and Engagement live stream series, Safety and Reopening, Getting Members Back to Work. The presentation will begin momentarily. If you have questions that you'd like to direct to today's guests, please email pteoe@sagaftra.org. That's pteoe@sagaftra.org. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and you can watch the replay right here on SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel. Now, please welcome back our host, SAG-AFTRA President, Gabrielle Carteris.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to be with you. I hope that you're staying healthy and safe. So today's presentation couldn't be more timely since production is actually resuming, and indeed in a limited fashion, but it is resuming around much of the country. So every day we're seeing more and more inquiries, clearance requests, notifications from producers and members. So many of us are just walking a fine line, and we want to get all of our members back to work as possible, but we're not willing to do that at the expense of safety. So that's what today is about. We've been keeping you all updated, and I hope you've been following along on our critical work through, you can see that the work that we're doing through emails that we've been sending, the Return to Work Hub on our website, that's at SAG-AFTRA. .org. You can look there and see what's up to date. The topic has been covered extensively in the press, and so many of us are following that nonstop. And with all that, we wanted to provide you with this comprehensive update and the look ahead of where we're going and how we're going to re-enter work. But before we begin, I just want to say a really quick hello to our Executive Vice President, Rebecca Damon, and our Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel, Duncan, Crabtree-Ireland. They're going to be actually leading today's presentation along with our National Executive Director, David White. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. So they, along with the Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety, have been working tirelessly since the industry shut down. The minute in March it happened, we started to work on identifying a safer way forward to return to work because we knew that that moment would come, and here it is. So before we begin, I just want to say, I kind of give you a little bit of a lowdown about how we've been responding to the unprecedented, and when I say unprecedented, I mean that, challenges we're facing as a result of COVID-19. This pandemic actually has created a massive undertaking for us, and we do it with pride, but it is a lot of work. We're sharing today the result of the work that we've been doing with working with our sister unions and guilds. That has been a really collective, cooperative experience. If there's going to be a silver lining, that has been one of them, working together and we're doing that also with epidemiologists, public health experts, employers, other industry partners, government agencies, and members, again, within our union, leaders and staff who've made incredible progress as a result of this collaborative work we're doing in creating guiding principles and fleshed out safety protocols. So as the industry makes careful progress in reopening, we have to really be able to acknowledge that members are going to experience, and this is experience a whole different way of working on set. It's something that filming will be different in this COVID environment, and it's important for us to recognize it. So our goal with this work is actually to keep the cast and crew, to keep everybody as healthy as possible by setting up structures that will allow for a safer way back into work. And as you know, it's been changing on a daily basis. The world we live in is changing. So even with the new medical and scientific information that is emerging due to this virus, as we move forward, we have to know that it's going to ebb and flow. The information will actually, facts will be the thing that will lead us. And that means we're fluid and we will adapt with the information that comes out. But thus far, this is where we are to make sure that all of our members have as much information as possible. We want you to be able to make informed choices. Getting back to work, as important as it is for all of us, it's really important that you are empowered with the understanding of what's taking place so you can decide if you feel safe enough to come back to work. Because again, We've said this before, there is no such thing as a safe set. There's only a safer set, and you have to feel empowered with knowledge. So we're going to try to leave some time at the end of this presentation for questions. If you haven't already submitted yours, you can send, again, Pam said, to pteoe@sagaftra.org. That's pteoe@sagaftra.org. And we will then answer as much as we can. Without further ado, I would love to give David White, our National Executive Director, a moment to speak.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and hello to everyone. It's interesting, we've been talking about this now since late March, and our original idea was that this virus would move from Asia to Europe to the United States. We would get it under control, and then we would be concerned about the Southern Hemisphere and making sure that we kept our jurisdictions safe and kept the work that we had going on here within the states safe. And that is not where we are at right now. Where we are at right now is a summer surge that has moved from the East Coast to the West Coast and from north to south. And that really underscores the significance of this presentation and making sure that members have information about our safety protocols, but also the underlying work that we have been doing within the industry, because the spread of this virus now can move from one place to another pretty quickly. And so the systems that you all are about to hear, testing and zones and all the other things that are in this terrific presentation, anchors our thinking about how to keep members safe, regardless of where production happens. This anchors our thinking and forms the basis for the negotiations, discussions that we're having with studios and then with a variety of other employers. So we're excited for you all to have this and to learn this information. And we want to make sure that we've got time for questions at the end. So without further ado, let me turn this over back to you, Gabrielle, and then you'll introduce the presenters.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I'm hoping that this will, everything that we're putting forward will ultimately will find a vaccine, and that will be done. But until that time, please listen from Rebecca and Duncan, the way of moving forward to return back to work. It's a great presentation, and we'll talk after. So thank you. Rebecca, Duncan.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, David. So Duncan and I are going to walk the members through this conversation, and we're going to start by sharing our screen about what our whole process has been in terms of COVID-19 safety protocols. And as Gabrielle mentioned, this is not something where when we immediately understood when this pandemic hit that whatever the return to work would look like would be something that would be an evolving process. And so the first part in this process started with SAG-AFTRA, along with the industry, putting out a white paper. There was a request from the governors of New York and California, Governors Cuomo and Newsom, to have us develop with the industry some basic information. And this was a joint process in terms of labor and management, an effort together to work through with our existing safety group, as well as our Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety, to really have sort of for policymakers a way for them to be able to think through what this world of work would look like in the middle of a pandemic, something that none of us had ever lived through before. So we were able to lay out those key principles, but also knew that this was sort of that top level discussion. It was something that we've subsequently provided to all the governors around the country, other territories and otherwise, to be able to look at other unions around the world. And so this was a really important first step for us to be able to sort of figure out where we might fit in as different governments go through their phases. The people that worked on this were a vast group of people. Gabrielle and David both mentioned, various, all the studios. So you think about the AMPTP companies, things like HBO, Netflix, Walt Disney, you name it, all of the different unions and guilds. And I don't know if we're progressing on the slides. All of the different unions and guilds to be able to work together. So it was all of the IATSE and their affiliated craft unions, the DGA, Teamsters. So we had just a real wide breadth of people that worked to put that together. And that was sort of a foundational document that had a real key element in the mix that included testing and regular and consistent testing being part and laid out in that document. The idea of PPE, and it kind of sounds funny to me now because we've all been in this pandemic a little longer together, and so those kinds of basic things at first had to be established. So at the time that we were doing this, we were really at the cutting edge of establishing these things. Things like hygiene and sanitation and how that would work, physical distancing, making sure there was training. We talked about a COVID compliance officer, which I like to call the health safety supervisor, along with our other union colleagues, and the concept of paid sick leave. And the work on this was really tremendous because we worked with our Blue Ribbon Commission. I need to also thank David and Gabrielle and Duncan specifically, because their work in bringing together, along with all the other unions, this coalition of unions to work together both on this and also on the safe way forward, it really was tremendous. And Gabrielle used the word unprecedented, and we've always had great relationships with our sibling unions, but I've really just been impressed with the leadership of all of the other unions, along with our own, in terms of making this such a collaborative process where we can unite in our interests to make the safest possible set for everybody on it. And I'll turn it over to Duncan, Crabtree-Ireland, our COO and General Counsel, who is also leading a lot of these safety efforts for us from the staff side. So go ahead, Duncan.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Rebecca, and totally agree with everything you said. I think we should probably mention that this document, along with all the other documents, or almost all the other documents that we'll be talking about today, are all publicly available. And should you want to check them out, you can find them at sagaftra.org/back-to-work, and we'll give you that information towards the end of the presentation again as well. But certainly the white paper was a really important first step towards where we've gotten today. The next thing that sort of happened in the sequence after that was the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health on June 11th issued a set of protocols for the reopening of the industry in LA County. And while this is obviously limited in its effect to activities happening in Los Angeles County, I think it's valuable to know about it because other jurisdictions around the country have also done this. This is the direct result of the kind of work that was done with the white paper and also the outreach that the unions were doing to these health authorities to try and influence and make sure that the protocols they put out would be sufficiently protective to make sure that our members would be returning to work in environments that were safe enough. So this is an example of one of those protocols. It's also available on our website, and you can find on the LA County Department of Public Health website as well. It's about a 10-page document of detailed protocols about how the return to work is supposed to happen. And if you read through it, you'll find that it's in most ways very consistent with what was said in the white paper and also what was said in the document that was to come. We've given you just a couple of screenshots here to give you an example of the kind of level of detail that we're talking about. And just like we have been continuing to update protocols, and we'll talk more about that shortly, LA County has also updated their protocol several times since it was originally released on Thursday, June 11th, to take effect the following day. Then something that did actually happen the very next day was we released our joint union document, so if we can advance the slide, called the Safe Way Forward. And this is a joint union report between the Directors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, IATSE, and the Teamsters. And I think, Rebecca, you mentioned this already, but it's really worth noting that this is an unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination between these unions. Normally, we do cooperate, we do coordinate, but each union does its own thing. In this case, I think the leadership of the unions really realized early on that the best way to build our strength in dealing with employers on these issues, and also to make sure that there weren't dozens of different documents out there with slightly inconsistent protocols, et cetera, was for us to all come together and work together on these documents. So this is about a 36-page detailed protocol that was put together by these four unions together. Really quite a historic thing. And the difference between this document and the white paper that Rebecca already described is, first of all, this document was put together just by the unions without the involvement of the employers. And this document is intended to be a detailed, practical walkthrough of how the types of protocols and protections that need to be in place can work on a real life set. And so it's informed by the participation of members and people who actually do this work on a day in and day out basis. And one of the other things that's really remarkable about this document is in part 2. And I know a lot of people don't really have the time to read a 36-page document about protocols. I hope you will, but if you can't, I definitely encourage you to take a look at part 2, because part 2 of this document goes into detail about the science behind testing. And Rebecca already mentioned that testing is one of the key elements of a safe return to work. And that was established back in the white paper, the Joint Labor Management White Paper. But this document actually goes into great detail about exactly why testing is so important, what impact testing has based on modeling done by epidemiologists of hundreds of models run on this, and precisely why the recommendations in the document are there in terms of what testing should be, in terms of frequency and how it should be carried out and what types of tests should be used. And I think that transparency and sharing that information publicly is really important, because if you look around, you'll find that pretty much no other protocols are doing that. Employer protocols, even government protocols, really are not laying out the science underlying it. This way you can look at it, read it for yourself, and understand precisely why it's viewed by all of the unions as so important. So if we could go forward to the next slide.
Yep.
These are some of the key elements from that. Rebecca, would you like to walk through some of these, and then I'll pick up whatever you don't?
On this and what Duncan said about laying out the science for people to see. I really have to thank you and all the other unions, DGA, IA, and the Teamsters, the commitment to safety and the changing as we know more, as the science advancing with it. There are things that we do know, and from those things, we were able to develop these things like the zone system. And the zone system, and it's been called other things in other documents, but I like to think for people to be able to think about this zone system where zone A is the place where, so if you think about the performers and the people that are interacting heavily, like the zone A can be the people, like the performers and the makeup artists and those people that are engaging in with people that at certain points will not be wearing PPE. And the development of the zone system really matters, because there may be people that are far on the exterior of production in terms of they're not at the heart of where production is actually taking place, where there is no PPE or where makeup is being put on, that are in a different zone, in a zone B. So it's very helpful if you take a moment, and Duncan mentioned it before, to go to SAG-AFTRA .org at the Back to Work Hub to actually read this part through. If you're going to read anything in your time at home, if you want to give yourself a little break from binging shows, I really recommend at least reading the back part of this document so that you can start to envision for yourself what that's going to look like. And then we talked about COVID testing. And for COVID testing, this is actually just the cornerstone of this, and as it says in the document, and to test or not to test, turns out it isn't a question. You need to test. And it is just critically important for not just for our members, but for how we're ever going to move forward out of this pandemic. So when thinking about testing, I'm going to let Duncan, do you want to go through some of the details of testing?
Sure, absolutely. So what is recommended by the Safe Way Forward report, and I want to emphasize this is a science-based recommendation. This comes from epidemiologists, a team of epidemiologists hired by the Directors Guild, hired by SAG-AFTRA, hired by IATSE and the Teamsters, that all together looked at this modeling that was done by the Directors Guild epidemiologist and formulated this recommendation that's unanimously supported by the organizations, which is that testing should happen for people in Zone A, as Rebecca just described it. That's the core zone where performers have to work without PPE and without physical distancing. That testing for people in that area should happen 3 times a week. And that for Zone B, which is crew who do not interact directly with performers when they are working without PPE or physical distancing, so that outer part of the production, for them 1 time a week testing. And this slide that you're looking at now is actually one piece. Like if you were to look at just one page of that 36-page report, this is the one that I would want you to look at, which is why it's a slide in the presentation. It is from part 2, and this is the graphical representation of the models that were run by the epidemiologists. So there's a lot of words explaining it in the document, but this is sort of the summary of it in a visual form. And so what you're looking at here is a series of charts that reflect the different models that were run. The top row is if there's no testing. The second row is if there's once a week testing. The third row is if there's 3 times a week testing. And the bottom row is if there's daily testing on set. And so this obviously, these models make certain assumptions along the different axes of the charts. You can see different sort of community infections and infection rates, et cetera. But the bottom line is where you see bright yellow, that is bad. That represents a larger proportion of COVID infections. And where you see deep blue, that is good. That's where you have the least risk and probability of infections occurring. And so you can see just by looking at the chart, going from no testing to once a week testing makes an enormous difference in the likelihood that somebody might contract COVID on set. If you then take it from that second row down to the third row, go from once a week testing to 3 times a week testing, you can see there is again a very significant jump in reduction of risk. And then finally, if you go to the last row, which would be daily testing, there is still improvement, although the improvement is a little bit marginally less than it was for the previous leap from weekly to 3 times a week. And one of the reasons why this is so important to analyze is it also explains why it's important for performers, the ones who are at the greatest risk and have to work in close proximity and without PPE, and those around them need to be tested more frequently than those outside of contact with them, because there is a huge benefit just from weekly testing that is clear and justified. But where somebody is in that enhanced risk group or is working with people who are, that's the justification for moving to the 3 times a week testing. The daily testing is primarily reserved at this point in our recommendations for special cases, and that would be, for example, intimate scenes. That could be certain types of stunt work, fight scenes, et cetera, where people would be exerting themselves in close proximity to each other. And that could also include certain types of work that are inherently risky like that, which could include, for example, dancers who might be working in close proximity, even though it might not be a fight or an intimate scene. Or it might also include certain types of work that are themselves considered to increase the risk of spreading infections, such as singing and especially group singing. So all of those concerns are reflected in the detailed protocols that we're working on or that have been released. And but this is the overview, and the general point is testing is essential, because if you don't have testing, what you have is that first row. And just looking at that bright yellow in the corner, you know, without testing, the risk of infection is very high. And that's why all of the unions have unanimously made testing the centerpiece of the COVID prevention protocols for people who inevitably have to work in proximity to performers and others who work without protection and without physical distancing.
Great. And Duncan, you mentioned all the different protocols. So obviously the safe way forward gives the baseline for what a safer set looks like. But a little later in the program, we're going to go over a little more detailed on hair and makeup, costumes, things that specifically affect our members. And you also mentioned areas that might need, you know, a little additional works, things like intimate scenes and those special protocols, you know, that might be in the mix. So do you want to introduce this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, obviously dealing with scientific protocols and how to keep people safe is serious business, and it's quite intense. We've all spent many hours doing that. But I think it's also important to realize that sometimes a sense of humor is necessary. Intimate scenes are a topic that people can sometimes be a little touchy about. But one of the things that I think was very interesting was early on, at the beginning of the quarantine, actually, I think the first week of March or so, one of our SAG-AFTRA shows, Saturday Night Live, actually put on a sketch that specifically addressed the question of how somebody might handle protection of performers in the context of intimate scenes. And so we thought we'd just share a brief clip of that with you. So we can go ahead and play that. That'd be great. Now, but so obviously those are not our intimate scenes protocols, even though they do incorporate some important real world ideas, including physical barriers and maintaining physical distancing. So, but in reality, intimate scenes are an area, as I mentioned, similar to certain other types of scenes that will require special protocols in order to help make sure that people are safe. That can include more frequent testing. That can include certain other measures as well in terms of making sure that the contact with other people is minimized, that the fewest number of people are on set as possible. And also, from the perspective of performers, it's important to note that some of those precautions will also require their own precautions. So, for example, one of the things that will be happening is more remote viewing of scenes to reduce the number of people on set. So if somebody needs to participate in a scene, but they don't need to be physically there, remote monitoring may be possible. But for intimate scenes, we're making sure that controls are placed on that so that there are no more people able to be present during the recording of an intimate scene than there should be, even though remote monitoring is used. So even with COVID safety protocols in mind, there are also other aspects that we're taking into account in developing those details.
Yeah, and Duncan, I just want to also highlight the work of, we've been working for a long time with intimacy coordinators and helping to advance that in our field of work. But I really want to also single out all the intimacy coordinators along with the members who participated in this aspect of the process, because their thoughtfulness and help and guidance has really impacted the directions we're going with all this. So definite shout out to all of them, and they know who their fabulous selves are. We've been going forward looking at these additional protocols, and these additional protocols, next slide, Kamale, are to get into some of the extra details of work, you know, the different unique production and work environments, and, you know, also protocols with other unions and other organizations. And I'm going to turn it over to Duncan for a moment to start talking about our collaboration with the IATSE.
Absolutely. And I think it is great to note that in areas where there is either where other unions impact upon the work that performers do, it's really important for us to all be on the same page. It helps make sure that protocols are actually implemented in the real world and reduces the amount of resources that have to be spent on enforcement because everybody's on the same page to start with. I also want to note, as we've got on the screen here, we also have protocols that have been developed outside. This webinar is mainly focused on the film, television, and new media industry, but we also have protocols that are developed, for example, in our news and broadcast area. Our broadcasters have been working pretty much consistently since the start of the pandemic, doing their job covering this news, often at great personal risk. And so SAG-AFTRA has also been very involved in putting together protocols to help protect their safety as much as possible in their very diverse workplaces. But if we move on to the next slide, we can talk for a few minutes about some protocols that we developed jointly with the IATSE, because they, of course, represent the workers who do the work in the hair and makeup as well as wardrobe and props areas. And so from the beginning, we knew that doing that together was essential so that we would all be on the same page. I do want to emphasize the full detailed protocols for hair, makeup, wardrobe, and props are publicly available on our website at sagaftra.org/back-to-work. And we'll give you that link on a slide a little bit later. But these are just some highlights from those protocols. So we encourage you to go read them in full when you have a moment or when you'd like some light bedtime reading. So for example, in the hair and makeup protocols, among them are requirement that full PPE be worn when a hair or makeup artist is working on a performer. And this is particularly important because obviously we're talking about some of the most close-in contact that will happen between people on a set where the performer is not able to wear PPE, because obviously if you're having your makeup done, you're probably not going to be able to wear a mask. And so what that means is that the hair and makeup artist needs to be doubly protected. So for example, in this protocol, it calls for not only a mask to be worn by the makeup artist, but also a face shield so that there's an additional level of protection. And when working close up on people's faces, for example, gloves. Side note, gloves are not generally recommended. The CDC and other health authorities do not encourage gloves as a general use item because it turns out they actually increase the risk of transmission in certain circumstances. But for this type of work, it is recommended, and that's included in our protocols. We also have additional details regarding ventilation and physical distancing of hair and makeup setups to help make sure that during the time a performer is being worked on, that there is adequate ventilation for maximum possible protection. The protocols call for limiting the amount of time that a performer has to be without PPE, i.e. Touching up and finalizing makeup as close as possible to the start of actual shooting, so that performers don't have to sit around without masks or other protection for extended periods of time. Calls for the use of disposable single-use makeup tools wherever possible, so that there's not a concern or an issue with sanitizing those tools, or that they might inadvertently be reused without sanitization. And also calls for all of the tools and supplies that are going to be used for particular cast members be kept in individual cast supply bags, so that they are not subject to accidentally being reused on other people. And also calls for specialized training for hair and makeup artists and anyone really who has to be in close proximity to performers who have to work without physical distancing or PPE. I don't know, Rebecca, you were involved in the negotiation or discussion of these items with IATSE. Do you want to add anything on that point?
Yeah, well, first off, I was just so delighted to be with our other union members as we thought through what this would look like in the times of COVID-19. I was impressed by their tenacity and level of detail that they brought to the conversation. All that expertise, I think, has really paid off along with the commission's work. And so when I think about this, it's you know, so important, and it's things that we maybe take for granted, the single-use tools, all those kinds of things, and making sure that every last area of detail was spelled out, and the commitment on all our part to have, you know, enhanced training around it, so that everybody is 100% on the same page as we are resuming work. And so it's really been a wonderful collaboration. And Duncan, did you want to also now on the next slide talk about wardrobe and props a little bit, because that's
Sure.
a similar collaboration with the IA.
Absolutely, yes. This is another area where, again, there was a in-depth collaboration with the IA. And so that includes, first of all, making sure that full PPE is worn whenever wardrobe or props team members are interacting with performers. As far as costume and wardrobe goes, providing for private dressing areas for performers that minimize the need for any in-person interaction, even with members of the wardrobe and costume department. It calls for physical distancing at all times when wardrobe and costume activities are going on, and includes a protocol stating that costumes should be bagged separately for each performer, so that performers' costumes do not commingle with other performers' costumes or outfits. It also provides for disinfection of wardrobe items before and after use by each individual performer. And there's a variety of methods. You can read the protocols and see that there's a variety of methods for that, but they need to be CDC approved and adequate for ensuring that COVID-19 is disinfected and destroyed by that process. The wardrobe protocols also specifically call for the use of individual use stunt pads and not sharing stunt pads between performers, and that production should acquire and pay for stunt pads as needed. It, in the props section, details how prop food and beverages should be handled, including the fact that multiple setups should be produced at the food source, so that it minimizes the need for prop department people to touch any aspect of the food during the course of setups on set. And finally, both the wardrobe and props protocols limit contact with either wardrobe items or props items to a limited number of departmental staff prior to them being provided to the performer, to help reduce the possibility that someone might contaminate any of those items through touching them prior to their use. Those are just some of them. There's a number of other protocols. Again, we just picked out the key highlights for you. And again, we recommend that everybody check out those documents when they have a minute.
Yeah, it's so important that everybody really does familiarize themselves. We sort of made the joke about reading the big long document, but you know, it really is important that you understand what is expected when you return to work. And that's part of this. You know, the only way that we can make a safer workplace is for all of us to be able to think that through together. So obviously, Duncan, you have focused on in the presentation the work with obviously like AMPTP type companies, but these principles actually do carry forth to other areas, but that also need additional protocols under development. And next slide, Kamala. those additional protocols for, we've been working with groups singing, commercials, voiceover, dancing, stunts, minors, performers with disabilities, intimate scenes, which we covered a little bit earlier, and more. And I think the importance of this is the principles remain the same no matter what kind of work. However, there may be certain things in terms of where they're carried out or how they're carried out. Do you want to talk, Duncan? And I'm not sure if here's the place to do it, but at all about short duration productions, perhaps?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that we do have is what I would describe as a modular protocol for short duration productions. And it's modular because it can be slotted into a variety of other areas, protocol areas, but it's designed for productions that can be completed in 1 to 2 days. So obviously that's a certain type of production. And in those cases, the testing protocols can be streamlined and simplified because of the short duration of the production, in contrast to, you know, a feature film or a television series where you need protocols for how people are going to be testing on an ongoing basis. So we have that protocol as well, which is designed to be a little bit easier for a producer of those types of projects to understand, but which is 100% consistent with the science and the philosophy of our testing protocol for all productions, which we've been very consistent about across all these areas.
Great. Next slide. Great. So we were able to collect some of the things as we've been having these conversations with the commission, with the various committees, all the member groups that have been heavily engaged in this, the questions that have come in over time. We have kind of our best asked, and if you recognize some of these as your own questions, they certainly are, and then we'll take some for the group, but these are the ones that we get all the time. So Duncan, can you answer for all those members listening at home? And I'm hearing from some of the folks on the East Coast that they're battening down the hatches with the hurricane coming up the coast. It's quite a blow right outside of New York right now. What role does collective bargaining play? What is that? Explain that in this process, what the role is.
Well, absolutely. And let me just say before I answer that, yes, for everybody on the East Coast, I hope you're staying safe, and our thoughts are with you. Hopefully things will be okay with the
hurricane
there. Yes, exactly. As far as collective bargaining goes, it does have a role in the protocols for a couple of reasons. First of all, some of the protocol issues do deal with money issues, and those are things which we'll talk about in more detail perhaps in a minute, but things like compensation for testing, things like sick leave, et cetera, those have to be negotiated with employers. As a union, you can't just unilaterally mandate those, even though you can publicly state what you think the standard should be. And that same thing is true for a number of on-set type of issues. So there is collective bargaining going on, not only with the AMPTP, but with other employer groups as well, and of course with individual signatory employers as necessary. But what I would say is the good news is that generally speaking, with some exceptions, we have been able to get a great deal of cooperation from employers, and I hope and expect that will continue. Doesn't mean we always agree about everything, but I think when we explain the reasoning behind the protocols and recommendations and requirements that we have, I think they make a lot of sense to people. And I think that's one of the reasons it was so important, Rebecca, that we published all of the scientific basis for the testing recommendations, because when you actually read part 2 of that document, it's very hard to argue with the merit of that recommendation.
Yeah, so Duncan, can you talk a little more now about testing? And so there were a lot of questions and ideas around testing, and the situation in testing, you know, in any given area and in different parts of the country has, you know, it's clearly evolved over time. And can you talk about that, the cost, all that, so people sort of just get a framework for that, and you know, in some areas where there's limited testing, those kinds of things, if you could walk through that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, this is definitely one of the areas that is evolving most rapidly in connection with these protocols, because I don't think anybody doubts the importance of testing, but the ease of arranging it and the cost of arranging it has changed over time and does vary from location to location. The bottom line is how difficult it is to arrange testing. The short answer is it depends. Depends on where you are in the country. It depends on how committed the producer is to making it happen. The good news is it is, although there are exceptions to this, depending on certain hotspots in other areas, in general, the availability of testing is increasing. It's increasing quite rapidly. And also there are businesses sort of springing up who specifically function both for our industry and for other industries that require testing. And their role is to arrange and provide for testing outside of the sort of standard public testing options, so that the testing that the industry needs doesn't impact or detract from publicly available testing or other people who might need testing. And so that's a really good development. Another thing that I think is important to know is we've been able, through continued study, to expand the range of tests that the unions consider acceptable for purposes and reliable for purposes of our testing protocols. That started out, and if you read it in the Safe Way Forward document, it states that nasopharyngeal testing, which is the sort of longer nasal swab testing, at the time that report was issued, was the only accepted method for COVID testing. Since that time, based on continued studies that have been released and our epidemiologist review, we've been able to expand on the types of testing that are acceptable to include what's called anterior nasal, which is sort of the shorter, closer to the front nasal swab, and also to oral swab testing and so-called spit testing. So there are now a greater variety of sample collection methods, which I know will be great news for a lot of performers and everyone else in the industry, both because it increases the availability of tests and also makes it more comfortable and convenient to collect the samples for those tests. In addition to that, there's new testing technology that we've been able to approve to allow for more rapid testing and for greater availability of testing equipment for things like mobile labs and remote testing locations. So that is all good news. Some of the things that people do really need to know, though, is antibody and antigen testing are not approved for purposes of determining if someone is currently infected with COVID. This is the position of the CDC and the FDA, and it's also the position of all of the unions. And we know that sometimes people, either out of genuine confusion or because it's an easier path, sometimes choose to portray antibody and antigen testing as being the same thing as PCR viral testing, and they're really not. So if somebody is telling you that you can do a quick finger prick blood test for COVID-19 that takes 15 minutes, most likely that's not an approved test from the union or from the FDA. I mean, it could be approved from the FDA and CDC, but not for determining if you are currently infected with the virus. So as technology changes, we certainly update those approvals and recommendations, but it's really important that we stay focused, because having someone sort of test for whether someone had COVID at some point in the past doesn't tell you whether they're currently infected, and doesn't give you the level of assurance that's necessary to ensure the performers who have to work without those kind of protections, without social and physical distancing, without PPE, will be in a safe enough environment. As far as the cost goes, the costs range widely depending upon the method of testing and where the lab is in connection in relation to where the samples are collected, et cetera. So the lowest sort of quotes that I've heard are around the $18 to $25 per test range, up to an excess of $100 per test. So it really varies. And one of the things that we're doing to help producers, especially smaller independent producers, to find testing is putting together a list of resources for them that they can reach out to of different types of testing providers and vendors, so that they can find a testing solution that meets their needs and in terms of timeliness, in terms of cost, and still fulfills the requirements of the protocols.
So Duncan, a misconception that people have a lot of times is who pays for the testing? Can you clarify that? Because that I sometimes think that gets missed, at least in emails to me, that gets missed by people.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, Rebecca, because it is very clear the employer, the producer, should be paying for testing. So if a producer tries to get you to pay for testing, please alert us to that fact. We will correct their mistaken impression that they could do that. In many states, it's not legal for them to do that. It's certainly not permitted under our collective bargaining agreements to do that. And we expect employers to pay the cost of testing and also to arrange for the testing.
Absolutely. And Duncan, can you talk a little bit about other types of production? We kind of went through some of the various areas where protocols are in process or complete. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I've definitely heard from members who've read through the Safe Way Forward and sort of said, hey, this feels like it's written for big budget studio production. What about other types of things? What about short films? What about independent features? What about web projects that I'm working on, or commercials, or just any number of different music videos, any number of other types of production. And first of all, you're correct. I mean, when you read it, it does read through as though it's intended for a large set. But the principles that are laid out in the Safe Way Forward are really applicable across all types of production. These core principles include things such as having testing on a regular and frequent basis, the type of testing that we're talking about. It includes using the zone system for production. It includes having a COVID compliance officer or COVID supervisor or health safety supervisor, depending on which title you're using for that position, but having someone on set who is specifically responsible for making sure that COVID protections are enforced, and that there's someone to go to who has authority in the case that there's a problem happening. That includes all the sanitation requirements, et cetera. Those are really broadly applicable. And that's one of the reasons why we've released the separate hair, makeup, wardrobe, and props protocols jointly with IATSE, because we know there are productions that need that type of guidance at all levels of production and all types of production. And so those freestanding protocols are out there so that those productions know what they are and can use them and make sure that they're followed in productions. What we're doing at this point is we are engaged in pre-production meetings with all of these different types of productions to make sure that their COVID safety plans are compliant with the protocols. That will be moving into a more electronic process in the future as the volume of production increases so that we can keep pace with it. But in all of those cases, what we're looking for is to make sure that each production, no matter what type it is fundamentally compliant with the principles laid out in these documents.
Great. Duncan, so if I arrive on set and the precautions are not as expected, what do I do?
Absolutely. So the first thing you should do is always watch out for your own safety and do what you feel keeps you safe. You have a number of options when you get to a set and you feel like something's a concern, depending on how extreme of a concern you view it to be. There should be a COVID compliance officer or COVID supervisor on set. You can always take your concerns directly to that individual. So if, let's say the concern, for example, is you see some people who aren't wearing their masks. They clearly know they should be, they're hanging down around their neck, but they're not wearing them. That might be the kind of thing that you would mention to a COVID supervisor so that they can then take on the responsibility of making sure those people are instructed to put their masks back on and to address it. If it's a more systemic problem, that also needs to be taken care of. Now, obviously, there will be times on set when maybe you can't find the COVID supervisor, or if the COVID supervisor isn't responsive to your concerns, or perhaps as a performer, you don't really feel comfortable personally bringing attention to that issue. You can absolutely report that issue to the union, and we can reach out to production depending on the nature of the problem, either by phone or by sending a field rep out to the set to address those concerns. Also, all of the major producers will have anonymous tip hotlines that you can call to report COVID safety issues on set. And I want to just also note that in addition to the unions enforcing our safety protocols, we have the benefit of having resources such as health officers from the local health department, such as the federal and state OSHAs, also including state labor commissioners, for example. And as unions, we often will call upon those law enforcement and government officials to help if needed with sort of recalcitrant production situation. But I do want to emphasize that in the vast, vast majority of productions that we have encountered, producers are cooperative. And if there is a problem, they have been fairly responsive in most cases to our outreach and gotten those problems fixed pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm glad your first example was about people not wearing masks as chin guards. That's as a New Yorker, that makes me happy that that was your first example. My own personal pet peeve. There you go. Too much information. So, Duncan, who is ultimately responsible for maintaining a safe set, just for those who might not be sure?
Absolutely. And I think this is really key. So I'm glad that we're talking about it, because the producer, ultimately, the employer, has the responsibility legally to maintain a safe set. So the role of the unions here is for us to make sure that we are holding producers accountable to that standard. But the producer's the one in control of the set, the producer's the one with that legal responsibility, and we're going to hold them to account for that responsibility. But your unions are in essence the employees. They are, we are the members embodied and going out there, standing up for each other and making sure that appropriate standards are in place and that people follow them. But the employers and producers have that fundamental responsibility, and everyone should always remember that and hold them accountable for it.
Great. And so one of the questions that I've received from so many members, and it's here for us today, is, what happens if I do contract COVID while I am working? And next slide, Connolly, thanks. Duncan, you there?
So yeah, what happens if you contract COVID while working? So first of all, this is going to another answer that depends. It depends on how we determine this. So we've had examples, for example, where somebody has actually been tested as a result of the testing protocols we put in place, and a COVID infection has been identified before the person ever even reported to the set. That's the ideal goal. That's one of the reasons why there will always be a pre-employment COVID test before people start reporting to set and working without PPE and without distancing. So when that happens, of course, that individual will then be told, do not come to set, go to your medical provider, get medical treatment, and quarantine for the required period, which is typically 10 to 14 days, depending on the current guidance from the CDC in that particular moment. And so that's sort of the simplest case. If someone has already reported to the set and they either develop symptoms or they get a positive test result after they've been working, then this is where contact tracing will come in, and a determination will be made about who that person's been in contact with. Those individuals will need to be retested and temporarily quarantined while a determination is made. In a situation like that, it's quite likely that the production will be at least temporarily shut down in order to allow those things to happen. So it really depends on when this is determined and how. And I want to just also note that one of the open topics we're working on now is the question of sick leave and payment for people who might be unable to work as a result of COVID. It's our desire to see that happen. It was mentioned in the white paper, in the Safe Way Forward. All the unions are unified on this. And so we do anticipate that there will be, in many productions, it's going to depend on the contract area, how it will work precisely, but that in many areas there will be some form of compensation or sick leave payment if somebody is unable to continue on in the production as a result of coming down with COVID. Yeah.
And another question that we got multiple times and what's coming in the last day or so is if I am working different places in the US, or what if I'm working abroad? Those kinds of questions have come up multiple times. So different protocols if I'm in New York, California, Alaska. Talk to me, Duncan.
So our protocols are designed to be national in scope. They're not designed to vary by location. And so the fundamentals would be the same everywhere that you may work. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't take into account unique circumstances in a given area. There may be areas where, due to level of outbreaks or other concerns, that additional protections may be required of the production. There may be areas where performers can feel a little safer on set as a result of low incidence. But I do want to just point out that while the situation in the surrounding community is important, that because of the nature of performers' work and the fact that in many cases performers are traveling, at least some performers are traveling to many different productions, you can't completely rely on the location in which the production is occurring to make those determinations. And that's why there's a sort of standardized threshold of minimum safety requirements that we see as applicable across all productions regardless. So, the fact that someone's producing in a remote ghost town in the middle of the desert, in the middle of, a state somewhere, doesn't mean that there's no risk, and it doesn't mean that protocols don't need to be in place. They do need to be in place, and for the reasons that I just mentioned. As far as traveling abroad goes, obviously that poses some additional issues. First of all, the travel itself. Second of all, what the rules and regulations will be in that foreign location, because one of the things that we have to recognize is that foreign governments don't always operate the way that we're accustomed to. Their priorities and values may be different. And so as a general rule, when SAG-AFTRA members travel to work on a SAG-AFTRA contract, our protocols will be in place, and they should expect that to be the case. There may be modifications in certain places due to local laws and regulations, in which case those will be discussed between SAG-AFTRA and the producers, and the performers will be informed of that fact as well in advance.
So another question we received a lot of different versions with particular circumstances, but to put it into one that's good for the whole group is, if I am already contracted pre-COVID to work, but now I feel unsafe coming to set. Maybe I have an immunocompromised, maybe that's me, maybe that's somebody in my household, or a parent, a child, whatever. What now?
Well, if you have a legitimate COVID-related concern about reporting to work on a project that you're contracted to do, you can count on the union to defend you from any kind of claims by the producer related to your being unwilling or unable to report to work for that reason. We are establishing that with producers as we go, and we feel we have a very strong basis in labor law for that type of defense and protection. I do want to note that that is for legitimate COVID-related concerns only. Every now and then you'll hear about somebody, trying to use a circumstance to advantage a negotiation or to renegotiate something or whatever. Those types of uses would not be appropriate for this. And if it's provable that somebody is sort of using COVID as an excuse to renegotiate, that's going to be a problem in terms of the union being able to defend them. But if it's a legitimate COVID concern like the one that you described, Rebecca, absolutely, each member is going to have to make a determination for themselves what level of risk they're willing to take, and the union will back them on that. Bearing in mind that, and it's very clear, at this time, there is no such thing as a 100% safe set. That's just not possible under the current circumstances. The sets are going to be as safe as possible, and we're going to do everything that can be done to reduce the risk of exposure, but it will not be a zero risk. And so if somebody has special considerations that make that an unacceptable risk for them, then they should feel empowered to act on that.
Duncan, I'm glad you raised that, because from the beginning, when we started this process, you, the leadership of SAG-AFTRA, the staff of SAG-AFTRA, we've all been approaching this into how can we make it as safe as possible. And knowing that, full disclosure, my perfectionist mindset wants to get it as close as absolutely possible to that. I also realize that everybody has a different risk tolerance, a different set of circumstances, all of that. And I think that has been really one of the, I would say, challenges, but I would also say real successes of having worked on this, is to see the level of detail that has been put into this, all the while understanding that everything that has to do with this virus ultimately ends up based on not just science, but people's choices and people's behaviors around it. So it's really helpful to sort of think of all of this in that lens, and that we are really all responsible for each other. And these protocols take that into account. So I really appreciate that.
Can I just say also, Rebecca, I think it's really important for people to hear, and sometimes they just need to be empowered to say, this is not business as usual. It feels like sometimes people get onto set and they feel like they're expected to pretend like everything is normal. Well, these are not normal times. This is not business as usual. And everyone should feel empowered to stand up for their health and safety. And if they need help doing that, if they can't do that for whatever reason themselves, they should reach out to the unions, and we will, if they're SAG-AFTRA members, reach out to us, and we will help stand up for them, because these are really issues of life and death, and it is not business as usual.
Yeah, and that's the seriousness that we've been taking around this, both as members and as staff. And I do think it is so important for people to really hear that, digest it. And, they're going to be, for some people, this is not going to be the moment to resume work. There are other people that are chomping at the bit and all of those things. None of our circumstances are the same. There isn't a right or wrong answer to this for people. It is really that self process. But if you are going to be headed back to work, doing it in the most informed and the safest way possible, given the science and information that we have, is what the goal has been here. And with that in mind, this has been a lot, but I know it is only the tip of the iceberg. People who are not involved on a day-to-day level want to know, how do they keep up to date on the protocols, new developments, all that stuff. I would start with read your emails, which is like my favorite. I always want people to read their emails. But what else?
Absolutely. So definitely keep up with your communications from the union and your emails. Also, the webpage that we're going to give you in just a second, in fact, we can probably go ahead and switch over to that slide, is a great place to go. That's where it's the SAG-AFTRA.org back to work page. That's where we will be posting protocols that develop. We have FAQs there already, which we will continue to expand as questions come in that need to be answered. I mean, it's great to answer a question for one person, but when it's a question that a bunch of other people probably have, we really want to answer that in an FAQ form so other people can benefit from those questions and answers. And so this is a great place to sort of just check in regularly. We'll email you with alerts about big things, but this would be a great place to check in and as I said, find that reading material that you might need to flesh out your knowledge. Because I don't want to run out of time before we close, I want to also just state earlier on, I think both you and Gabrielle had mentioned the work of myself and David White, our executive director, but I really want, and I think you also acknowledged collectively the team, but I want to specifically acknowledge that we have a tremendous staff team that's been working along with our extraordinarily committed elected leadership on these issues. And so even though I often get the chance to talk about this, or certain other leaders get to talk about this, this is not, a one-person show. This is something that involves a large number of our elected leadership and our staff making this happen. It's very complicated and an immense amount of work. And I really appreciate all of them and just want to extend thanks to them for the commitment that they've shown during this very challenging time. And likewise to the members of the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety as well, and our different contract area committees and various other members. So many members have been involved in developing these protocols, and it's really appreciated their volunteerism.
It really has been a union-wide effort, both staff, elected, our outside experts, Dr. Fielding and all of our other experts, and also all of the other unions elected and staff teams along with their experts. I mean, the collaboration has been incredible. I know we have some additional questions since we did the melded ones. I think Gabrielle has some more questions for us. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Great.
I think, first of all, you guys, great presentation. So thank you. And I've seen it 1,000 times as we've gone through this, but each time it's really the reinforcement of it. So yes, we do have questions. We are also actually almost out of time. So I'm probably going to get to maybe 2 of the questions. And again, others will be answered online. You'll be able to see that at sagaftra.org/back-to-work. And, but here we have Kenyatta. The question is, on TV shows, there's a count of 25 union members and 85 movie union members. With the COVID-19 precautions, will these numbers possibly decrease, meaning it's going to be harder to get background or stand-ins work?
So our contractual covered numbers will not decrease as a result of COVID-19. And so what that means realistically is that non-covered positions will be the first. If there's a reduced amount of hiring, it will come out of non-covered positions first. We don't really know yet what the impact is going to be on hiring. We don't have contractual requirements for them to hire a certain number of people. It's just however many people they hire, the first X number of positions are covered union positions. And so the answer to that question is it remains to be seen. We are encouraging producers to continue to use background in the same way and stand-ins in the same way that they have before. And we have successfully removed from any documents or anything else, any suggestion to the contrary. The only area in which you'll find any mention of anything like that is with large crowd scenes, which would obviously be far above those numbers to begin with. And even that is just a single mention. So I think the point is we are very concerned about those positions remaining for background and stand-ins. It's not something we can compel the employers to do, but at this point, it does appear that there is hiring still continuing in those areas, and we will not be in any way reducing the numbers called for covered positions in our contract.
Duncan, I want to say something though. I think it's important. It's true. We've worked very hard to make sure that there's no interference with hiring our members. But I think that it's realistic to know in this short period of time, and it's not just background and stand-ins, it's co-stars, guest stars, everything, you know, it's a challenge. When we talked about earlier, when I said this, because I think it's important to be this transparent, is for all of us, is that we want to go back to work. And we know it's going to look different when we go back right now. And the difference will be even how they structure the sets in terms of how many people are, you know, in a space at the same time, whether you're in, you know, the, group A or group B, it won't matter. There's going to be adjustments. We know that there might be less location shooting. They're talking about doing a lot more stage shooting because they need to go and adapt to the fact that they want to have a really safe environment, or the safest environment possible. So they have to have controls. These are real situations, but to remember, with that being said, we are putting everything forward to make it possible for everybody to be able to go back to work, and things, you know, are going to be different for these next couple of months, and we're going to just do the best we can.
Can I just add to that, Gabrielle? I just want to mention that our Safety Commission and our Executive Committee approved a set of principles that we're using to inform everything we're doing on these protocols. And one of those principles is that safety, the importance of safety and the safety protocols do not depend on what the scope of your role is or what your position is on a production. So we don't view safety as any different no matter what type of performer you are, or what type of role you have, or anything like that. There are certain areas where special protocols might need to be in place because of industry practices. But from our point of view, all performers are to be treated equally with regards to safety issues. And I believe we've been extremely proactive and consistent on that principle.
So important. Thank you.
One other thing, Gabrielle, just to note, is the only area where we've seen things like that have to do with overall cast and crew size. And that is something that, depending on certain areas here included, have limitations on those numbers. And what you see is as the infection rate goes down, they have plans to have those numbers rise. And so that is something that I know has come up a lot. And, you know, living in, and I'm pretty sure Kenyatta is a New Yorker. I'm pretty sure I'm talking to a fabulous member there. What I also know about this is where, to get us back to the thing that looks the closest to normal, also requires us as citizens to do things that are like I take the wearing the mask seriously because I do that as a citizen, but also as a member, I encourage it in everybody that I know, no matter where they are, because getting through this pandemic requires us to actually do the things that get us through the pandemic. And so as we've been having discussions with state and local governments around the country, there is that idea that we do have a role to play, right? So the more that we are encouraging that, the sooner we can get back to something that looks more like what we think it looks like. And it really does require all of our participation in a big way. And just from my own discussions in this highly dense environment, there has been real talk of people wanting to get back to the look and feel of production that they've always had. But again, it requires that infection rate staying low. So wear your mask, tell your friends to wear masks. It's the path back for all of us.
Thank you. I'm just going to do one more question, and then we're going to need to go. But this is from Matthew. With the latest studies coming out about aerosols that can linger in enclosed spaces for hours, my concerns about casting offices, primarily small windowless rooms where actors have to take their masks off and stand in the same place that previous actors have stood with their masks off and spoken, yelled, sung, all spreading activities. Any suggestions to curb this risky activity? For instance, I would love if casting offices were encouraged to set up tents and parking lots outside. I would gladly go to castings in that case. Thank you.
I think the very first thing that we're doing about this is we've explicitly encouraged all initial casting to be done virtually. And the feedback that we've been getting is that that is well received. And in fact, a lot of casting people that as an option themselves as well. In fact, I think we had some feedback from a panel that we were on last week, where some folks involved in that process on the casting side were basically commenting on how there were some real benefits to the casting director performer interaction from doing more casting, where there's that kind of, even though it's virtual, it's direct, as opposed to through a recorded audition tape that then a casting director looks at later and there's no direct interaction. So anyway, but in any event, we are encouraging strongly that all initial casting be done virtually, and in fact that all casting be done virtually unless there's a reason for a specific callback or for some sort of second audition, et cetera, to be done in person. And so I think that is a huge part of it. We do encourage and are developing protocols relating to specific details regarding ventilation and air filtration that may be useful for casting facilities like that. And we do have protocols in place that when multiple people might be auditioning together, that there would be physical barriers to separate them from each other and from people who are watching. So I think there are a number of protocols already in place in regard to this, but we'll continue, as I think Rebecca said earlier, all of these protocols are subject to evolution and change as we find new and better ways to do things, or as the science evolves, or as the practices in the industry evolve. So we will continue to look at that and update those protocols as needed.
Also, I just want to add that we know that casting directors also have been creating protocols to make sure that they want to live it, they want to work out of a safe space. So if you end up having to go, there are protocols in place. Each place before you go will actually let you know what's expected of you in terms of creating the safest possible space. I also want to say just a little bit again, when Duncan was saying, he's talking about self-tapes, that's been such a challenge for so many of our members. So we've done, and we'll continue holding panels where you can really learn how to self-tape effectively. I think that that's been really helpful. We saw that already happening prior to COVID. So it's almost like if there's been this exponential kind of growth towards self-taping, we really want to give you tools. But the Zoom idea, what Duncan's talking about, and really where so many of our casting and members are embracing that idea, we started to see a whole period of time prior to COVID where people weren't auditioning face-to-face with the casting directors or the producers. And there was so much incredible anxiety around the self-tape. Because of the Zoom and how it's grown, actually people are starting to interact. That's what Duncan's talking about. The interaction between casting and the actor now, that feeling of being live in the moment has been really a silver lining in this during this period. So, again, we are looking at different ways to make sure this can be the safest way possible as we move forward. And I want to say, when Duncan is talking about barriers in studios where you might have to do recordings, we are putting together protocols, the questions out there regarding voiceover and different ways that we work. How are those environments being created? You'll continually see information coming forward regarding that. We're working directly with the members who do this work to make sure that we can create